Picture a young man asleep on a cold office floor he can no longer afford to rent. His first company is dying around him. He is 21 years old, and before long he will leave town with one reel of film and almost nothing else. His name is Walt Disney. Most of us grew up with a version of this man. The cheerful mouse on the screen. The castle with the fireworks behind it. I grew up with it too, and assumed for years that was the whole story. It is not. Underneath the friendly version sits a harder one, and it turns on a single idea. Ownership. Who owns the thing you make, and what becomes of it once you are gone? Walt learned that lesson at the worst possible age, and it shaped almost every choice that came after. He built his whole life on one private rule. Own what you create, and never hand control to anyone else. The rule worked beyond anything he could have pictured, and yet the family that carries his name owns almost none of the company that bears it today. One of the Disney heirs now stands outside the gates and criticizes it in public, by name. So, how does that happen? How does a man build something this large on a promise never to lose control, only to watch his own bloodline lose all of it? The answer runs through A Stolen Rabbit, a film that should have ruined him, a strike that broke something in him, and a secret buried under a Florida swamp. To understand it, we have to go back to that cold office floor. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Slept in His Failure. He grew up believing his best days were already behind him. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago in the winter of 1901. While he was still a small boy, the family moved to a farm outside Marceline, Missouri. Those few country years became the place he spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild. The orchard behind the house, the animals he treated like company, he was pulled away from all of it too soon. By 1911, the family had moved again to Kansas City, and the farm was gone. In the city, the work started early. His father, Elias, took on a newspaper route, and Walt was out on the streets by 3:30 most mornings, carrying papers through the dark before school. He said later that the cold of those mornings never fully left him. There was little money at home and not much warmth, and he looked for both in the one place that answered him, which was the drawings he made. When the First World War reached America, Walt was still too young to enlist, so he lied about his age and shipped out to France with the Red Cross, driving an ambulance after the guns had gone quiet. He came home sure of one thing. He wanted to draw for a living, and almost nothing else held his interest. Back in Kansas City, he picked up commercial artwork, and he found a partner who would matter far more than either of them understood at the time. Ub Iwerks was quiet, and quicker with a pen than anyone Walt had worked beside. Together they started making short animated gags that played before the movies at a local theater. Audiences liked them. Those little cartoons turned Walt into a minor local name. It was enough to talk a group of Kansas City businessmen into backing a studio of his own, with $15,000. He was 20 years old. He named it Laugh-O-Gram Films, and for one short stretch, it looked like the beginning of something real. Then came the deal that showed him how the business actually worked. A distributor called Pictorial Clubs, out of Tennessee, agreed to pay $11,100 for a set of 6 cartoons. That was serious money in 1922. Worth well over $200,000 in today's terms. Walt and his crew delivered the work, but the contract was built like a trap. Pictorial paid only $100 up front, promised the rest on delivery a year later, then went bankrupt before another dollar ever came. The studio could not survive it. With no money coming in, Walt could not pay his animators, and they left for steadier work one after another. He cut everything he could, and gave up his apartment. By the end, he was sleeping on the floor of the office itself. He washed once a week at the public baths inside Union Station and lived on cold beans straight from the can. The same rooms that had recently held a working crew now held only him. Even then, he would not stop. A local dentist paid him $500 to make a short film about caring for your teeth. Rather than settle his debts with it, Walt put the whole sum into one last idea. He would drop a real little girl into a hand-drawn cartoon world and let the two share the screen. He filmed the opening of it, named it Alice's Wonderland, and bet that it would be enough to pull him out. It was not enough. In the summer of 1923, the studio went under for good, and it fell to iWorks to handle the wreckage of the bankruptcy. Here is the part I keep turning over. Walt Disney was 21, broke, and beaten twice by the same trade. Most people would have read that as a verdict and gone looking for a steady job. He read it as a reason to leave instead. So he sold his movie camera for a little cash and bought a one-way ticket to California. Into a worn cardboard suitcase, he packed the unfinished Alice reel and a few clothes. By the time he reached Hollywood, he had almost nothing to his name. No studio, no money worth counting. What he brought instead was one finished idea and a stubbornness that came close to foolish. It would take a second betrayal, a few years on and far more personal than a broken contract, before that stubbornness set into the rule that built an empire. Chapter 2. The Rabbit He Lost. The meeting was supposed to be a celebration. In February of 1928, Walt Disney walked into an office in New York, expecting to leave it richer. He was 26 now, and the hard Kansas City years were behind him. He had a hit. After everything, he finally had a hit. To understand why that room mattered, you have to back up a few years. When Walt reached California in 1923, he was not entirely alone. His older brother Roy was already there, recovering from tuberculosis, and the two of them set up a small studio together. Roy minded the money, and Walt minded the pictures. It was a partnership that would hold for the rest of their lives. Their first real success was a series called the Alice Comedies, which finally made the trick work that Walt had gambled on back in Kansas City. A real little girl, dropped into a drawn cartoon world. The films were distributed by a New York woman named Margaret Winkler, and then by her husband, a sharp operator named Charles Mintz, who took over the business after they married. By 1927, the Live Girl idea had worn thin, and Universal Pictures wanted a new cartoon star. They asked for a rabbit. Walt and Ub Iwerks gave them one and called him Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald caught on almost at once. There were Oswald toys and Oswald candy in the shops, the first merchandise to carry a character Walt had made. For the first time, he had built something the whole country wanted. So he went to New York to ask Mintz for the money to make the cartoons even better. The pay then was $2,250 per short. He expected to come home with a raise. Mintz offered him a cut instead, $1,800, about 20% less than before. And when Walt pushed back, the floor opened up beneath him. Mintz explained calmly that Universal owned Oswald outright, not Walt. The rabbit he had drawn and made famous belonged to the studio, and there was nothing Walt could do about it. Worse, Mintz had spent months quietly signing nearly all of Walt's animators to new contracts of his own. "Take the cut," he said, "or Universal would make Oswald without you, using your own people." It was a clean trap, and it had already closed. Walt refused. He would not take the cut, and he would not become a hired hand on a character that should have been his. He walked out of that office having lost his star and most of his crew in a single afternoon. Only a few men refused to sign with Mintz, and the one who mattered most was Iwerks. Before Walt even left New York, he wired Roy to lock Iwerks into a contract of his own. Then he boarded a train and started over for the second time in 5 years. The story Walt liked to tell is that the mouse came to him on that long ride home. A small character, built from the memory of a tame mouse that had kept him company at his drawing board back in Kansas City. He wanted to name it Mortimer. His wife Lillian thought that was too stiff, and offered Mickey instead. It is a lovely story, and I suspect it is tidier than the truth. What is certain is that the real design work fell to Iwerks. He reshaped the lost rabbit into a round-eared mouse, and animated the first cartoon almost by himself, behind a locked door, while the departing animators were still down the hall. The first 2 Mickey films were silent, and no distributor wanted them. The third one was different. For Steamboat Willie, released in November of 1928, Walt added the one thing the others lacked: sound. Mickey could whistle and keep time with the music, and audiences had never seen a drawing do that. It turned Mickey into a sensation overnight, and it turned Walt Disney into a name. But the lesson of that New York office never left him. He had made something the whole world would come to love, and watched another man carry it off on the strength of a contract he did not control. He would not be caught that way again. From then on, every character and every idea that left his studio would belong to him alone. The rabbit was gone for good. Everything that came after, he made certain he owned. Chapter 3. Disney's Folly. Hollywood had a name for the film before Walt Disney finished a single minute of it. They called it Disney's Folly. By the middle of the 1930s, Walt was no longer the broke young man from Kansas City. Mickey Mouse had made him famous. His silly symphonies had pushed cartoons into full color and won him a shelf of awards. He had a studio of his own, and money in the bank for the first time in his life, and he decided to risk all of it on an idea that nearly everyone around him thought was insane. He wanted to make a cartoon that ran an hour and a half, not a short gag before the main feature, but a full film, with a real story that could make an audience laugh and then break their hearts. Nothing like it had been made in America. The accepted wisdom in Hollywood was firm on the point. Audiences would never sit through 90 minutes of animation, the thinking went, and the bright colors would tire their eyes long before the end. Even Walt's brother Roy, who managed the money, and his wife Lillian, both tried to talk him out of it. He chose an old German fairy tale he had loved since he was a boy, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He had first seen a silent version of it in Kansas City at 15, and it had stayed with him ever since. Now he would build the entire future of his studio on it. He thought it would cost $250,000. He was wrong by a wide margin. As the work went on, the budget swelled past $1 million, then kept climbing, until the final cost reached nearly $1.5 million. In the depths of the Great Depression, that was a staggering sum, worth more than $30 million today. The studio poured everything into it. More than 500 artists worked on the picture, hand-painting something close to 1.5 million separate drawings. And the money ran out before the film was done. This is the moment I think the whole company should have died. Walt had mortgaged his own house to keep the work going. The loans from Bank of America had piled higher and higher. The bank had grown nervous about how much it was handing over for a cartoon no one had seen. When Walt came back asking for the last loan he needed to finish, the bank wanted proof. A vice president named Joseph Rosenberg drove out to the studio to watch the unfinished film. It was a strange screening. Much of the picture was still rough pencil tests and empty gaps, and Walt had to talk Rosenberg through them, describing how it would all look once it was done. When the lights came up, Rosenberg said almost nothing. He made small talk, walked toward his car, and seemed completely unmoved. Then, as he was leaving, he turned and told Walt the thing was going to make a fortune. The loan came through. Snow White would be finished. It premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater in Los Angeles on December 21st, 1937. The audience that night was full of the same Hollywood names who had laughed at the idea. Clark Gable was there, and so was Charlie Chaplin. By the time the dwarfs gathered around Snow White's glass coffin, grown men in the seats were crying, and when it ended, the room rose to its feet. The verdict came in fast. Snow White became the highest-grossing film of 1938. It earned around $8 million in its first release, more than any sound film before it. Walt was handed a special Academy Award for the picture, a single full-size Oscar with 7 little ones lined up beside it, presented to him by a young Shirley Temple. The Folly had become the most successful film in the country. He did not slow down to enjoy it. He took the profits and poured them straight into a new studio in Burbank, a real campus built for the kind of films he now knew he could make. The bet against the whole industry had paid off, and it had paid off because Walt trusted his own eye over every expert in town. That instinct would carry him a long way. It would also, before much longer, cost him something he never saw coming. Chapter 4. The Strike That Broke the Family. Somebody built a guillotine and carried it to the picket line. It was a prop. the work of people who built things for a living, and it stood on the sidewalk outside the Disney studio in the early summer of 1941. The men around it were not factory hands or miners. They were the studio's own animators, the artists who had drawn Snow White and Pinocchio, and they had turned on the man whose name was on the gate. To see how it reached that point, you have to look at what success had done to the studio. It had grown huge. The Burbank campus was a clean, modern lot, with a restaurant and a gym the older hands still talked about. But the two features that followed Snow White, Pinocchio, and Fantasia both lost money. And when the war closed off Europe, the studio lost about half its market almost overnight. Walt was quietly going broke, and he did not tell his artists. Admitting weakness, he seemed to feel, would only make things worse. Beneath the new buildings, resentment had been gathering for a while. The pay gap between the top animators and the young artists who inked and painted the cells was enormous. A share of the profits had once gone to the staff as bonuses, and Walt had quietly ended it. Perks at the new studio were handed out by rank. To Walt, none of this was a problem. It was his studio, built on his risk, and he believed the people in it should be grateful. So when the Screen Cartoonists Guild came to organize the place, he refused to deal with them, and pointed instead to a company union he controlled himself. In February, he called more than 1,000 employees into the studio auditorium and told them, in so many words, that they had it good and would need to work harder. Many of the younger ones walked out of the room calling it a sob story. What broke it open was personal. Art Babbitt was one of Walt's highest-paid animators, the man who had created Goofy and animated the Wicked Queen in Snow White. He had everything to lose, and he led the union drive anyway because he believed the artists below him deserved better. Walt took it as a betrayal from inside his own house. He fired Babbitt along with more than a dozen other union members, and the next day, the 29th of May, the studio walked out. About half of the 1,000 artists went on strike. The signs they carried were sharp and funny, the work of people who drew for a living. One showed Pinocchio and read, "There are no strings on me." On the first morning, Walt had the picket line photographed and the pictures enlarged, so that every man who crossed knew he had been seen and counted. Then, day after day, he drove his car straight through the crowd at the gate. One of those mornings it nearly came to blows. By several accounts, Walt spotted Babbitt in the line and went for him. The two had to be pulled apart while the strikers booed and shouted. It was the clearest picture of what the strike had become. Not a negotiation, but a falling out between men who had once worked side by side. The pressure came at Walt from every side. Technicolor refused to process his film, and printers would not run the Mickey Mouse comic strip. The wider labor movement called for a boycott of everything the studio made, and in the middle of it the artist slipped a quiet revenge into Dumbo, the film then in production. A troupe of circus clowns marches off singing that they are going to hit the big boss for a raise. The clowns are still in the picture today. Walt did not win. President Roosevelt sent a federal mediator who sided with the union on every point. Worn down, nearly broke, and pushed by the government to leave on a goodwill tour of South America, Walt let the studio settle while he was away. The guild was recognized. The strikers came back. The younger artists got their raises and a 40-hour week. For many of them, it was the first time their names ever appeared on screen at all. I do not find a clean villain in this story. The artists had real grievances and a legal right to organize, and they won because their case was strong. But it is just as true that something in Walt went cold on that picket line. The studio he had built had felt to him like a family, and the family had turned on him in public, using cartoons he had paid for. He never fully forgave it. The bitterness hardened into something worse. He took out an advertisement in the trade papers blaming the strike on communist agitators. Years later, in 1947, he sat before Congress and named the strike as communist work, testimony that helped feed a blacklist that ended careers. Many of the artists he lost scattered to other studios and never came back, and Walt came away more guarded than before. He had spent his whole life learning never to let anyone take control of what was his, and now he began to turn toward a different kind of project. A world he could build from nothing and run alone, where no one could ever walk out on him again. Chapter 5. Black Sunday. On a Sunday in July of 1955, more than 28,000 people poured into a park built to hold about half that many. It was supposed to be a controlled event. Walt Disney had sent out around 15,000 invitations to the opening of Disneyland, his new park in Anaheim. It was an invitation-only preview, the one the park still counts as its first day. The guests were mostly studio workers and reporters, but the tickets were easy to copy, and counterfeits flooded the gates. One man propped a ladder against the back fence and charged people $5 to climb over. By early afternoon, the place was nearly twice as full as it was ever meant to be, and almost nothing was ready for them. To understand why this day mattered so much to Walt, you have to remember where his head had been. After the strike, he had grown tired of a business full of people who could organize against him or own the things he made. He wanted something else. A place he could build from the ground up and control to the last detail, where no partner held the rights and no crew could walk out. He used to sit on a bench on Saturdays while his daughters rode a carousel. The parks of the day struck him as grubby, and he thought there ought to be a clean one where parents and children had fun together. Disneyland was that idea made real. Almost no one wanted to fund it. Roy thought it was a distraction, and the bankers saw a rich man's hobby. So Walt raised the money himself. He borrowed against his own life insurance. And he made a deal with the television network ABC. The network put up about $5 million in exchange for a weekly Disney show, a program that spent a full year advertising the park before it had even opened. The whole thing cost around $17 million and was thrown up on 160 acres of orange grove in a single year. That kind of speed leaves marks. And on opening day, every one of them showed. The asphalt on Main Street had been poured that morning and was still soft. Soft enough that women's heels sank into it as they walked. A plumber's strike during construction had forced Walt into a brutal choice, working restrooms or working drinking fountains, and he had picked the restrooms. As he reportedly put it, people could buy a drink, but they could not pee in the street. So on a hot afternoon, with close to 30,000 bodies inside, the fountains stood dry and the drink stands ran out. Rides broke down. A gas leak shut part of the park for the afternoon, and the riverboat took on so many passengers that it listed to one side. Outside, the freeway backed up for miles. And all of it went out live on national television. Walt hosted a 90-minute broadcast with Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, and the actor Ronald Reagan, beamed to something like 90 million viewers, close to half the country. Behind the cameras, it was chaos. Hosts tripped over cables, and microphones cut in and out. But the broadcast did its job. What the audience at home saw was a clean, bright, finished wonderland, and they wanted to go. Inside the company, the day became known as Black Sunday. Walt only grasped how bad it had looked when he read the papers the next morning. One columnist accused him of skimping on water fountains to sell more soda. Another called it the worst opening he had seen in 30 years of show business. Walt did not hide from it. He called the reporters back himself, and set about fixing the park piece by piece. Within weeks the crowds were back, paying their own way this time, and they kept coming. By any honest measure, Disneyland worked, and it changed what an American family did on a day off. There is an irony in it I have always liked. Walt had built Disneyland to be the one place in the world that answered only to him. No union, no distributor who owned the rights, just his vision built exactly as he wanted it, down to the color of the fences. And on its very first day, the thing he could not control was nearly everything. The crowds forced their way in, and the ground stayed soft under everyone's feet. He had finally built his perfect world, and it spent its opening day reminding him that no world is ever fully under one man's hand. Disneyland gave Walt the happiest decade of his life. The park was a hit, the company was thriving, and his name had become a household word across the country. But there was one force he could not wall out or buy his way past, and it was already at work inside him. Chapter 6. The Walnut in His Lung. The X-ray showed a shadow on his left lung about the size of a walnut. It was the early part of November, 1966. Walt Disney had gone into St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, just across the street from his studio, complaining of pain in his neck and his leg. The lung was not what he came in for, but it was the thing that would kill him. He had smoked all his life, unfiltered cigarettes mostly, sometimes a pipe. For years his staff could tell he was coming down the hall by the sound of his dry, hacking cough. Now the cause of it sat plainly on the film. The surgeons opened his chest and took the whole lung. The tumor was cancer, and it had already spread to his lymph nodes and beyond. The doctors knew he did not have long. He did not stop working. He left the hospital and went back across the street to the studio. His last good days went to the thing that had taken hold of him, a project down in Florida. The plan was a second park, far bigger than Disneyland, and beside it a real city of the future where people would actually live. By more than one account, in his final days, he used the squares of the ceiling tiles overhead as a map. He would lift a hand and point out where each piece of it would go. There is a stranger detail from those last days. Among the notes he scribbled was a short list of names tied to studio projects, and near the bottom, for no reason anyone has ever been able to explain, he had written the name of a young actor under contract to him, Kurt Russell. Russell has confirmed it himself over the years. Nobody knows what it meant. He died on the morning of the 15th of December, 1966, 10 days after his 65th birthday. The man who had spent his whole life making certain he controlled everything he touched had finally met the one thing he could not bend to his will. His death was not announced for several hours, for ordinary reasons. Family had to be reached. Executives had to be told. The studio he had built woke up the next morning without him. 2 days later he was cremated, in a small private service for his immediate family alone. His ashes were placed at Forest Lawn, in Glendale, in a marked family plot you can stand in front of today. That, in plain terms, is what happened to Walt Disney's body. But that is not the story most people heard. Almost at once, a rumor took shape that Walt Disney had not been buried or burned at all. He had been frozen, sealed in a tank of liquid nitrogen, the story went, and hidden away to be thawed and revived once medicine had caught up. In some versions, he was stored in a secret chamber beneath the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, which happened to be under construction when he died. It is a story that refuses to die, and not a word of it is true. You can see how it took hold. The first version came from a tabloid reporter who claimed a few weeks after the death that he had slipped into the hospital dressed as an orderly and seen Disney's body in a cold steel cylinder. Newspapers around the world ran it. It helped that the timing was uncanny. The first person ever frozen by the new science of cryonics was suspended about a month after Walt died. And it helped that Walt was already the man of the future in everyone's mind, the one who built tomorrow for a living. If anyone was going to cheat death with a machine, surely it was him. 2 later biographies repeated the claim and gave it a long second life, though both were picked apart for sloppy sourcing. The plainest answer came from the person who would know. Walt's daughter Diane wrote in 1972 that there was no truth to it at all, and that she doubted her father had ever even heard of cryonics. The death certificate says cremation. The plot at Forest Lawn is a matter of public record. I understand why people wanted to believe it. It is hard to accept that the man who gave the world so many happy endings did not get one of his own. He was 65. He had just drawn the future on a ceiling, and the project he cared about most, the one in Florida, was barely begun. He would never see a foot of it built, which left a hard question for the one person who had stood beside him from the very start, the brother who had watched the money since they were both young and broke. What was Roy Disney supposed to do now? Chapter 7. The Empty Lot. In 1965, companies nobody had ever heard of began buying up the worthless swampland of Central Florida. The names meant nothing. There were fronts with bland labels like Bay Lake Properties and Reedy Creek Ranch, and one after another they bought parcel after parcel of cheap, soggy scrubland southwest of Orlando. They paid a little over $100 an acre for ground most local owners were glad to be rid of. Nobody could work out who was behind it. The guesses ran wild. Some said it was Ford building a plant. Others guessed Boeing or the space program down at Cape Canaveral. The one name almost nobody landed on was the right one. It was Walt Disney. He had wanted a second park for years, this one on the East Coast. That was where most of the country lived, and few of them had ever made it out to California to see Disneyland. But he wanted more than a park this time. At Disneyland he had learned a painful lesson about control. The moment his gates opened, cheap motels and tourist traps had crowded in along the edges of his land. They fed off the crowds he drew, pocketing money he felt belonged to the experience he had built. He had controlled everything inside the berm, and nothing past it. In Florida, he meant to own it all. So he kept the plan hidden. If word got out that Walt Disney was the buyer, the price of every acre would jump overnight. His lawyers set up a string of dummy corporations, fronts with invented names. The purchases ran through a Miami agent and a real estate firm whose own people were never told the name of their client. The front that gives this chapter its title was a small private joke. They called it MT Lot. Say it out loud. Empty lot. I will admit the whole scheme is hard not to admire. In all, the fronts bought about 27,000 acres from 51 separate owners, an area twice the size of Manhattan, for a little over $5 million. Walt paid roughly $80 for his first acre. By the time the secret broke, he was paying $80,000 for the last. And the secret did break. A reporter at the Orlando Sentinel named Emily Bavar had been covering Disneyland's 10th birthday. When she pressed Walt about the Florida rumors and got a string of clumsy non-answers, she put it together. In October of 1965, her paper named Disney as the buyer, a few weeks before Walt had meant to announce it himself. On the 15th of November, he stood beside the governor of Florida and confirmed the whole thing. He had pulled off a land grab on a scale the state had never seen, and he had done it for $80 an acre. What he wanted to build there was bigger than any park. The Magic Kingdom would come first and pay the bills, but the real dream was a thing he called Epcot, an experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Not an attraction, a genuine city of the future, with real residents and real streets, a working town the rest of America might one day copy. And to run it free of the usual rules, he had the state of Florida grant his land its own form of government. The district could write its own building codes and lay its own roads. He had finally found a way to control not just a park, but a place, down to the laws inside it. And then, in December of 1966, before a single building rose from the swamp, Walt Disney died. The project fell to Roy. Roy O. Disney was nearly 77 and ready to retire, the brother who had handled the money since the very beginning, when there was almost none of it. He put the retirement off and took personal charge of the Florida project, driving it to completion. And he made one decision that mattered more than any blueprint. The place had been called, simply, Disney World. Roy insisted it be renamed Walt Disney World, so that no one who ever passed through the gates would forget whose dream it had been. It opened on the 1st of October, 1971. Roy stood at the dedication and read the plaque himself. Then, 10 weeks later, on the 20th of December, Roy Disney died of a stroke. One brother had dreamed it, the other had built it, and within 5 years, both were gone. If you visit Walt Disney World today and look up at the windows along Main Street, you will find the names painted there. MT Lot, Reedy Creek. The fronts that bought the swamp kept on as a quiet thank you. It is the last thing the two brothers built together, and it closes the part of the story they were both alive to shape. From here on, the company they had carried up from nothing would belong to other people. And other people, it turned out, had very different ideas about what to do with it. Chapter 8, The Raiders at the Gate. By the early 1980s, the Walt Disney Company had become a sleepy giant, living off a dead man's name. The founders were gone, and so was their nerve. The films coming out of the studio were thin and forgettable. The parks still made money and the old movies still sold, but the company was being run carefully, almost timidly, by men who seemed afraid of doing anything Walt would not have done. Walt's son-in-law, Ron Miller, was in charge, and the magic had gone quiet. On Wall Street, that combination spelled opportunity. Here was a company sitting on a fortune it barely seemed to notice. The film library alone was worth more than the whole stock was priced at. And that was before you counted the land in California and Florida, or the 2 parks that printed money. To a certain kind of investor, Disney did not look like a beloved institution. It looked like a discount. The man who moved first was a corporate raider named Saul Steinberg. In 1984, he began quietly buying Disney shares until he held about 11% of the company, then made his intentions plain. He offered to buy nearly half of it, or to swallow the whole thing, and either way the plan was the same. He would break Disney into pieces and sell off the film library and the land to whoever paid the most. The studio that Walt built would be carved up for parts. Disney panicked. It went on a hurried buying spree of its own, snapping up other companies just to make itself too big and too expensive to swallow. It did not work. Steinberg kept coming. So the company did something that still leaves a bad taste. It paid him to leave. In a deal that summer, Disney bought back Steinberg's stake for around $325 million, handing him a profit of roughly $30 million for a few months of menace. There is a word for this, greenmail. And I would say it is finance at its ugliest. To raise the cash, Disney borrowed over $1 billion. It came out of the whole affair more than $800 million in debt, with its own shareholders furious and its stock sliding. The payoff saved Disney from Steinberg, but it left the company bleeding and exposed, and the other raiders could smell it. That was when the family stepped in. Roy E. Disney, Walt's nephew and the son of the brother who built Walt Disney World, had walked off the board months earlier in frustration with how the place was being run. Now he came back with allies. He brought in a wealthy Texas family, the Basses, as friendly investors. Together with them and a sharp advisor named Stanley Gold, he gathered enough shares to take real control of the company's fate. In September of 1984, they forced Ron Miller out and went looking for someone to run the place. What they found was a pair of outsiders. Michael Eisner, a brash programming executive from Paramount, took over as chairman and chief executive. Frank Wells, a level-headed lawyer from Warner Brothers, became president. Eisner brought a third man with him to run the film studio, a young, hard-driving producer named Jeffrey Katzenberg. For the first time since the brothers founded it, the Walt Disney Company would be run by men who had never met Walt. They owed nothing to his memory, and they had been hired precisely because they were willing to change everything. The company had been pulled back from the edge, but the price of survival was that the name on the building no longer matched the hands on the wheel. It worked, at least at first. Eisner and his team would haul Disney out of its slump and build it into something the founders could never have pictured. But the deeper story of the next 20 years is not really about the movies or the money. It is about control, the same thread that ran through Walt's whole life, and about what happened when the one Disney still in the building decided he wanted it back. Chapter 9. The Last Disney in the Building. In the autumn of 2003, an old man sat down to write a letter that would try to bring down the head of the Walt Disney Company. The strange part is that he was the same man who had put him there. His name was Roy E. Disney. He was Walt's nephew, the son of the brother who finished the Florida park, and by now he was the last member of the founding family with any real power inside the company. 20 years earlier, he had been the one who rescued Disney from the raiders and handed the keys to Michael Eisner. Now he wanted them back. For a long time that would have sounded like madness, because for a long time Eisner was a hero. He arrived in 1984 and pulled off a turnaround that stunned Wall Street. The animation studio came roaring back to life with a run of films that defined a generation of childhoods, from The Little Mermaid to The Lion King. The parks expanded, and the stock multiplied many times over. Eisner had taken a sleepy company worth a couple of $1 billion and was on his way to building one worth tens of billions. He did not do it alone. Beside him stood a quieter man named Frank Wells, the company's president, a careful lawyer and mountaineer who answered to the board rather than to Eisner. Wells was the brake on Eisner's ego, the one who could tell him no. I have come to think Frank Wells was the figure this whole story turns on, and the one almost nobody remembers. And on a spring day in 1994, flying home from a ski trip, he was killed when his helicopter went down. After that, the balance was gone, and Eisner began to come apart in slow motion. The studio chief, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who had driven the animation miracle, wanted the dead man's job. Eisner would not give it to him, and Katzenberg walked out to start a rival studio, DreamWorks, with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen. Then he sued Disney for the bonus money he was owed. After an ugly fight that dragged Eisner's private insults into the open, the courts handed Katzenberg a settlement reported at well over $200 million. To replace Wells, Eisner reached for an old friend, the Hollywood superagent Michael Ovitz. It lasted 14 months. Ovitz fit nobody and nothing, and when Eisner finally pushed him out the door, the severance package was worth about $140 million for a little over a year of failure. The shareholders sued over that one, and lost. The pattern was always the same. Eisner pulled more and more power to himself, and trusted fewer and fewer people, and the talent kept leaving. By the early 2000s, the company had lost its shine again. Even Pixar, the studio behind Disney's run of recent hits, grew so tired of dealing with Eisner that it announced it would take its films and walk away. That was the company Roy E. Disney looked at in 2003 and decided he could not stomach any longer. When Eisner moved to force him off the board over his age, Roy resigned first. On his way out, he wrote a letter telling Eisner plainly that he had lost the company's soul and should go. Then he did something a Disney had not done in decades. He took the fight public with a campaign he called Save Disney and asked the shareholders to rise up. They did. At the annual meeting in the spring of 2004, 43% of Disney shareholders refused to back Eisner, an open vote of no confidence almost unheard of for a sitting chief executive. The board stripped him of his chairmanship that same day. He hung on as chief executive for another year, but the wound did not close, and in 2005, Michael Eisner left the Walt Disney Company for good. Roy E. Disney had won. He had installed a king and then, 20 years on, helped tear him down, the last act of real family power the company would ever see. When Roy died a few years later, in 2009, something quiet and final happened with him. The name on the gates was still Disney, but there was no Disney left with real power over it. The company now belonged to its shareholders, millions of strangers who had never met a soul named Walt or Roy. And the man they had just chosen to run it was about to spend the next decade buying up the rest of Hollywood. Chapter 10. Who Owns the Mouse Now? In 2006, after 78 years, the rabbit came home. You may remember him from the start of this story. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, the character Walt Disney drew and named and then lost to the distributor who outmaneuvered him in a New York office in 1928. That was the betrayal that taught him to own everything he made. For most of a century, Oswald had belonged to Universal. Then Disney's new chief executive, a man named Bob Iger, quietly worked out a trade. Universal wanted a famous sports announcer who worked for Disney. Disney wanted the rabbit. So Iger sent the announcer to Universal, and Oswald came back to the company Walt built. It was a small deal, almost a footnote, but it closed a wound that was 78 years old. And it was a sign of what came next. Over the following 15 years, Bob Iger did something Walt Disney would have understood completely. He went out and bought the rest of Hollywood. First came Pixar, the animation studio that had nearly walked away in the Eisner years, bought in 2006 for around $7 billion. The deal made peace with Steve Jobs and brought him onto the Disney board. A few years later came Marvel and its army of superheroes in 2009 for about $4 billion. Then Lucasfilm, and with it Star Wars, in 2012 for another $4 billion. and in 2019, most of the old film empire of 21st Century Fox, for more than $70 billion. Piece by piece, Disney became a media empire bigger than anything Walt could have pictured, owning an enormous share of what the world watches. Walt would have recognized the logic of it, own the characters, control the whole experience, end to end. It was his own rule, scaled up to a size he never dreamed of. The difference was that it was no longer a family doing it. It was a corporation, run by executives who had never known him, answering to millions of shareholders who only wanted the stock to go up. And the empire was anything but peaceful. Iger stepped aside in 2020 and handed the company to a successor named Bob Chapek, then came back 2 years later when that handoff went wrong. Disney clashed publicly with the governor of Florida, and the special self-governing power Walt had won for his land was stripped away before the two sides reached a settlement. An activist investor named Nelson Peltz tried twice to force his way onto the board, and twice he failed. And in 2026, Iger finally handed the chief executive's chair to a new man, Josh D'Amaro. The company Walt and Roy had carried out of a borrowed office was now a prize fought over in public, from activist investors to the governor of a state. So where, in all of this, is the family? The answer is nowhere near the top. The Disneys have not run the company since Roy E. walked out in 2003. They hold a little stock and no more power than any other shareholder. And the most visible Disney in America today is not a defender of the company at all. Her name is Abigail Disney. She is Walt's grandniece, the daughter of the Roy who fought Eisner, and she has become a sharp public critic of the company her family built. Her target is the gap between the top and the bottom. She has stood with Disneyland janitors who told her that even working full-time, they could not climb above the poverty line, while the chief executive took home tens of millions in a single year. The story became a documentary. She speaks only for herself, she says, not for the family. But there she is, a woman named Disney, standing outside the gates of the company her family built, and telling the world it has lost its way. I came to this story expecting a fairy tale, and found a 100-year argument about ownership instead. It began with a young man who lost a cartoon rabbit and swore he would never again let anyone take what was his. He spent the rest of his life amassing control over everything from his characters to the laws on his own land. And in the end, the one thing he could not do was keep it. The rabbit came home. The family did not. Walt Disney built a kingdom on the promise that he would never lose control of it. And the final truth of his story is that control was the one thing he could never hand down.